Welcome back to the show. Today we have Ronnie Pontiac. He is an author, a musician, and also a former researcher for Manly P. Hall. And on top of all of that, just an all-around badass. And I really, really appreciate your time today, man.
Oh, thank you for having me.
Of course. Yeah, how you been?
I've been good, man.
So last time we talked, you brought up that you're kind of working on a book about the Rosicrucians.
I just finished editing it actually today, like the final time that I could add anything significant to it.
Yeah.
It's going to go now and get typeset. So it's based on all the most recent research. I mean, I also use all the traditional sources, but
Mhm.
there's been such a revolution in the study of this area in academia over the last 10 or 20 years that there's a kind of a whole new picture of what was going on there.
Yeah.
And I was really excited by it because I find this fascinating. And I also wanted to look at the context of where and how it happened
Mhm.
because it really was something that was part of the times that were occurring. And there were certain people who became hugely influential without really wanting to be in that area, like Rudolph II, the Holy Roman Emperor, the John Dee tried to convince to become like the Hermetic Emperor, and also Frederick and Elizabeth, the King and Queen of Bohemia, who kind of became the focus of hopes for radicals who wanted to see the end of the Catholic Church, or at the very least wanted the Protestants to unite to defend themselves from the Catholic efforts and the efforts of the Holy Roman Empire to regain control of all of Europe. So it was very complicated, like digging into all these different stories and these people who were living in obscurity versus people living very publicly, like the royals, and then the propaganda flying from both sides, good and bad, and trying to remove the coding or the taint of that from the actual events. It was fascinating. I really enjoyed it, and I think there will be surprises in it for people who are into the Rosicrucian story.
Yeah, all of it is so damn fascinating once you start looking into it. So I, for one, am extremely looking forward to your release. So where did you kind of find like tracing back the origins of the Rosicrucians?
First you have to define origins because
Hmm.
that has been one of the great controversies around Rosicrucianism. There's a traditional approach in Western esotericism, especially when talking about Rosicrucianism,
Hmm.
of kind of searching it back through the family tree of Western esotericism and always taking it back to Egypt, through the Neoplatonists and Plato and Pythagoras and Orpheus, and then back into ancient Egypt, because they thought that the Hermetica were truly ancient Egyptian texts. Then, of course, Casaubon looked at this linguistically and pointed out that they resembled Neoplatonic texts hundreds of years later, even thousands of years later. And yet today, academics are looking at it and saying, it was probably written down during the Neoplatonic times, but it does have a lot of Egyptian ideas in it. So maybe it really is, in a sense, Egyptian. So you could say that one of the origins of the Rosicrucians is this Western esoteric tradition, beginning with ancient Egypt and coming up through Greece and then up through Ficino and Agrippa and all the usual candidates. But is that really the origin of it? That's
Yeah.
kind of a story we're telling, and maybe it's true metaphorically, but was there a direct lineage from Egypt of teacher to student is highly unlikely.
Hmm.
And so if we try to look at the origin as, who were the people who first made this into a subject that became a source of not just public interest, but even panic as well as enthusiasm. And even that is like this complex, totally argued over point about history. Who could have been behind this? And there are very good theories about various people who might have been. My favorite, and the person who sort of emerged as the most constant likely candidate, for having written at least one, if not all three, of the Rosicrucian manifestos that started all this is Johann Valentin Andreae. And but there are others who've been pointed out as possible sources of it. And then sometimes it gets really wild, and they say Francis Bacon wrote them or
Hmm.
John Dee wrote them. I don't think there's any evidence for that.
Yeah.
Andre is kind of the perfect candidate for having written them. And you see in him a reaction to them and to how they were met out in the public world. Because this whole thing is like, I mean, in short, the new vision of it, at least the way that I see it from new research, is that Andre is like this guy who's 18, 19 years old. He's
Hmm.
in college. He's always been brilliant. His mother and his father were working in laboratories. His father actually lost his life early because of his chasing this alchemical dream. And he was writing utopias and writing satires when he was still a kid. Now he is part of this Tübingen circle, and you've got his teachers, people like Tobias Hess, and you've got his fellow students at the university. This is a major center of learning at the time. And these people were affected by radical ideas. There were writers that were being read like Giordano Bruno. John Dee had come around and toured around the continent and left a lot of ideas about political revolution and also about this kind of mixture of Christianity and Platonism and ceremonial magic. And there was this reaction among young Protestants, but also amongst intellectuals in the Protestant world who were beginning to become interested in what would become science. And a lot of this sort of first came into bloom while Rudolph II was the Holy Roman Emperor. This is a really fascinating character who, he was very uncomfortable being Holy Roman Emperor. He didn't like to go to the special events he had to go to. He didn't like to take meetings. He didn't like the diplomacy and the ceremony. What he was into was alchemy and art and astronomy slash astrology. And he was into, beautiful young women and collecting animals and rare plants and wonders from all around the world. So he would send painters to paint places that were supposed to be especially beautiful in his empire that he had never seen before. He would every morning he would walk through this room where he had all his friends who were painters. I mean, they weren't really his friends. He was patronizing them, but he treated them like friends.
Hmm.
And he would say, how's the painting going? And, here's a little tidbit of idea. Why don't you change the lighting over here? And then he'd walk into the alchemy one and he'd do the same thing. There'd be a bunch of alchemists working. How's it going? Well, why don't you try this? And he had his own kind of station in the alchemy lab where he could play around with, and he wasn't really playing. He was pretty good at it, various alchemical projects and experiments he was involved in. And because he was so fascinated with the Hermetica, with all these kind of Western esoteric ideals, he was surrounding himself with Kabbalists and with people who were pursuing the revitalization of Neoplatonism and of Plato's ideas. And he really collected objects that he used in a ceremonial way. For instance, he had this agate kind of a bowl cup kind of thing that he thought was the Holy Grail. And he would drink water from it in order to heal himself or to protect himself from evil spells that he thought were being cast against him, sometimes by the Vatican. And when he became Holy Roman Emperor, the first thing he did was turned out to be very important for history, which was he decided that he didn't want to stay in Venice. I'm sorry, in Vienna, where the Holy Roman Empire had its capital and had been there for generations.
Hmm.
He didn't want to be around his mother, who was this very strict Catholic. He didn't want to be near the Pope and all of these established Catholic institutions that were already there. And so his decision was to move to Prague in what was then called
Oh,
Bohemia.
yeah.
And he made Prague into this capital of all things esoteric and artistic.
Yeah, holy shit. I just heard that somewhere. I was listening to a book and I just heard that same exact thing. Like Prague was like the capital of alchemy at one point, like in that time
Oh,
period.
yeah, absolutely.
He kind of set that.
He totally did. And
Holy shit.
he was very tolerant. You know, he allowed the Jews to flourish. He told the Catholics they couldn't push around the Protestants. He wanted everybody to kind of be free to do what they wanted to do. And ultimately, toward the end of his reign, he actually made a declaration of freedom of religion to protect the right of every person to choose their own religion. And I believe that through people who were inspired by Rosicrucianism, that idea was kind of brought home to those who founded America and eventually became our protections for freedom of religion. His protections were torn up by his successor, who was a sort of Catholic warrior, you know, and who wanted to remove all the esotericism and the Jews and the Protestants from Prague and make it into a pure Catholic city. So because of these ideas, now everybody knew what was going on, right? They knew, wow, this emperor is really into this esoteric stuff. You know, he took a meeting with John Dee. He's got Michael Meyer, you know, living there as his symbolic doctor. He's got pretty much all the famous alchemists and the great fathers of astronomy passed through his court, and he was involved in their experiments. He got to look through some of the earliest telescopes and actually see parts of the heavens. And that these rumors. So now imagine this: you're in this group of college kids, and you're reading these radical writers. Some of them very ancient, like Boethius, but some of them very recent, like Bruno, who they knew had been burned at the stake for
Mhm.
his beliefs and for his scientific interests. And you're interested in these early forms of science. You're an intellectual, and you want to know all about the world.
Mhm.
You're moved by Plato and you're moved by the Hermetic writings. You're moved by Paracelsus and by Agrippa and by Ficino, the great authors of the Renaissance. And here is this emperor who is interested in the same things that you are interested in. Well, they were pretty excited about that. And certainly the original manifestos, in part, at least the first one in particular, was intended to kind of, I mean, maybe as a joke, but it says in there, listen, Emperor, you know,
Mhm.
why don't you become our hero, our champion, and you know, tell the Vatican to back off, and you will flourish under you. You know, you'll make knowledge something that people want again, and the sciences will be supported, and you'll be able to have all the alchemists doing wonderful things and helping to make decisions about how society should develop. And they even sent people to talk with him, where people wrote books and they dedicated the books to him in the hope that he would read it and he'd get the idea to say, I should do this. Well, it wasn't like that at all because Rudolph had no interest in taking on that kind of mess.
Mhm.
And when Dee came to him and said that the angels told him that it was extremely important that Rudolph take on the leadership of all of Europe to fight the Turks who were invading at that time and often and for
Yeah.
long periods,
Yeah.
that there would be a great revolution because God would support him and he would become this amazing emperor for everyone. There'd be a great renaissance. And well, he never saw Dee again. He wasn't interested in that kind of thing. He wanted to be in his castle, and they bring him beautiful young babes, you know, and
Yeah.
he'd trade sexual favors for jewels, and he had a lion who walked around with him. It was basically his pet cat,
That's a
and
pretty sweet
sometimes the
life.
lion would nip people, and he'd have to pay the person off. I'm sorry, you know, he gets a little excited sometimes. And he every morning he wanted to see his alchemy friends and see how they were doing and see his painter friends. And he wanted to take care of his beautiful and gray Andalusian horses. And that's how he liked to live. And in a
Yeah.
weird way, he's a very modern, like, you know, contemporary to us kind of a character. You
Yeah.
think how many of us would make those same decisions in a way if we were in his position? We would be like, please leave me out of all this imperial politics and all this other stuff. I want to do this stuff. I want to be on my own in my house and leave me alone, you
Mm.
know.
Mhm.
And but first, there was this enthusiasm amongst what would become known as the Rosicrucians, or suspected of being Rosicrucians, and all the people like them who were sort of these radicals who thought, let's convince the emperor to lead us in a holy war and end the Pope once and for all. We don't want popes.
Mm.
Well, Rudolph eventually, it just didn't work. I mean, the Pope did not like what was going on there. His younger brother was, I'll do it. I'll do a better job than him. I'm not into all that weird stuff. And surely enough, he was dethroned by his brother and kind of became this emperor only in name. And they started rolling back the freedoms that he had initiated there in Prague. And he became very bitter and very frightened by how he was stripped of power incrementally
Yeah.
and was so vulnerable for the first time in his life. And he could see what was happening, that the Catholics were moving in and they were establishing the Inquisition, and they were trying to just take over again.
Mhm.
When that happened, of course, a lot of dreams were dashed. A lot of radicals thought, oh, well, that's not going to happen. So in the meantime, the manifestos have been released. Now, that's a whole nother story in itself because they weren't meant to be. The first manifesto, the Fama, is circulating in manuscript, maybe as early as the late 1590s, but certainly in the 1600s. It's not published till 1614.
Yeah.
But that one seems to be, even though it's as some writers have been calling it science fiction, it's kind of magical realism. It has humor in it. It's politically radical. It's in a sense religiously radical, even though it says it's Christian.
Mhm.
And when it gets published, it's published by this guy Moritz the Learned, who's a noble not far from Rudolph in terms of where his lands are. And this guy's been plotting with other rulers of Europe for some time for a big war against the Vatican and the Holy Roman Empire. And I think, although we don't know why, I think that he sees the manifesto as an opportunity to get the message out and to see how people react to it. So without finding out who wrote this manuscript that he gets his hands on that's been circulating, he publishes it as a book. And this causes like this unbelievable reaction that no one expected. People go crazy with fear and anger. This is a trick of the devil. They're the devil's Jesuits. They're trying to destroy Europe, and they're enemies of everything Christian. And on the other hand, there are people going, I want to be a Rosicrucian, please, come and find me because I'd be a great Rosicrucian.
Yeah.
And people are writing books defending it, saying the Rosicrucians are right. And these things that they say are true. And other people are writing books going, the Rosicrucians are wrong about everything and they should listen to the Catholic Church. Hundreds of books and pamphlets are published in the next few years. Now, part of that is because printing has become more available.
Mhm.
So just like Elvis's career benefited from portable record players and little 45 singles so a kid could listen to him in their bedroom, you couldn't do that before. You'd have to listen to your music in the living room with mom and dad sitting there. Now you could have a book and you could publish a book much more easily than you ever could before. And so everybody jumped in. And the thing they wanted to talk about was these crazy Rosicrucians. Is this true? Is there this secret brotherhood? And what are their powers? And there were pranksters, I believe, taking advantage of this, like in Paris, where suddenly these handwritten posters went up, right? And they said, the Rosicrucians are here. We're here in Paris. And, if you are interested in being a Rosicrucian, all I have to do is say so out loud. And, we'll know. In fact, you don't even have to say so. We'll just know. I mean, it really reads like a joke, like a prank. And Paris went into a panic. They thought like these satanic, you know, uh, wizards were meeting with demons in Paris and were plotting on stealing the souls of the innocent. And I mean, it was really a nutty reaction. I mean, even like the big newspapers reacted with stories about, yes, it's true, there was one in this town and he met with a demon and people saw it. And it was just this crazy
Yeah.
kind of hysteria that spread through
Yeah.
Paris and parts of France, almost like a witch hunt.
Yeah.
And eventually they had like universities and political figures researching, is there such a thing? And we found one, and they found this one guy who was a painter, a master painter, but also a terrible drunk and really obscene person. And he claimed to be he admitted, I'm a Rosicrucian. That's right. And they said, there, that's the proof. There are Rosicrucians. And look what a bad guy this guy is. So they must all be terrible. Probably just some hothead who was like, yeah, damn right, I'm a Rosicrucian. Screw you, you know. And but they took it seriously, and it became this kind of matter of theology, and people argued about it in universities. Watching all of this, we can see Andreae react because he's horrified by it. Eventually, later on in his life, under his own name, he will publish a book that gives you all the types of people who reacted wrongly to the Rosicrucian manifestos. He tells you, you know, oh, we're talking about like hustlers who try to use it for their own benefit. We're talking about simpletons who don't even understand what it's about, but they think it's some magic way to make money or something. We're
Yeah.
talking about uh, rich people who collect art and think the ideas are interesting. I mean, you know, it sounds like today. I mean, in a way,
Yeah.
when you read it,
Yeah.
and but the fact that he took the time to write a book and publish a book about all the assholes who understood this Rosicrucian thing, to me sounds like he's probably the guy that was at the center of it. He does continue will continue to do this throughout his life, by the way. He will
Yeah.
restate Rosicrucian ideals in books that never ever mention Rosicrucians or roses or anything like that. Like in his book Christianopolis, which was a utopia. It was basically the same ideas as are found in the manifestos, but he completely repackaged them. And then another couple reasons why I think Andreae might have been the guy. There was another person that was pointed out as being a very likely candidate, but a copy of the Fama that belonged to him was found. And and in it you can find in his own writing, he writes, I think Johann Valentin Andreae wrote this. And then you've also got this communication between Comenius, who was this brilliant philosopher. He kind of invented modern education. We still use some of his educational ideas in education today.
Mhm.
And he was a kind of a wonderful character. He believed, for example, that everybody should be given an education regardless of race or gender. He believed that all knowledge should be gathered together and shared with everyone, that the books should be created that have all the knowledge that humanity has, and they should be given to all, and everyone will be able to read and they'd be able to know what's going on. And he thought that all the most brilliant minds of the time should be gathered together in what he called the College of Light, and
Mhm.
they should all work together and then teach the new generation of intellectuals how to be open-minded and pursue science and look at all religions as having value, not just the one. And so this became Comenius becomes another source of proof, I think, that Andreae was the founder, because when he went looking for Rosicrucians, because he wanted to be one early in the process, he wrote to Andreae. He was smart enough to write directly to him and say, hey, I'd like to be a Rosicrucian. And Andreae wrote him back and said, okay, well, really, we're just a small group of friends who got together, and after the joke was published, he calls it a ludibrium, a plaything or a jest, and he's referring to the Fama. And so he basically says there is no such thing. I mean, it's just a few friends getting together, and it was all a joke. So but they stayed friends, and this has tantalized esoteric historians who, in the past, thought that Comenius was Andre's agent, if you will, that Andre mentored him, and then Comenius becomes important in the history of America. He was offered the job as president of Harvard College very early on, and
Wow.
was influential on the early colonists coming over from England and their ideas, including education and religious freedom and such. So Andre's probably our man. He's probably the guy who is at least at the center of a group that writes the three manifestos, but he may have been the one who wrote all three.
Hmm.
The Confessio, which comes next, is is definitely a response. It's a bunch of metaphors, and part of what it says is, hey, you did not understand the fama. You took it literally. And what we're trying to do is something different. We're trying to do a universal reformation here. We're trying to liberate the world of knowledge. Well, of course, people took it literally again. So again, they were looking for this brotherhood who had special magic powers, and they had unlimited gold, and they were going to, and these were all metaphors.
Yeah.
Finally, we get the chemical wedding where it just kind of turns into almost theater. And you've got this female character who's walking around showing Father CRC, who's now an old man, through this kind of alchemical symbolic journey. And at one point, she's winking at you, the reader, saying, "Boy, he's in a bad mood, but I bet if I slept with him, he'd be in a good mood." And CRC laughs. That's probably based on English theater that was going through Germany at that time, which had a kind of bawdiness about it because the Germans were not doing that. They had no music, they had no theater, and they certainly didn't have ladies or men dressed up as ladies winking at the audience, with sex lines, delivered for a
Yeah.
laugh.
Yeah.
But that's in the chemical wedding, as well as some very deep observations about the spiritual life and religious history and politics and such.
Hmm.
And it is also perhaps in some way a depending on when it was written, a foreshadowing or a reflection of this marriage that was being taken as what was going to now revive these Rosicrucian dreams. So here we are after the death of Rudolph. The Rosicrucians are all depressed. That didn't work. Now we got another bad emperor, but they were kind of in between the emperors. And so there was this moment where the guy that everybody thought was going to be emperor, he was going to be given the job of king of Bohemia first. And so he takes that job, he moves into Prague, he brings a bunch of Catholic authoritarianism with him. And the Bohemians won't take it. They decide enough, and they take two of his favorite officers and they throw them out a window into a pile of dung. And they say, "No, you're not the king of Bohemia." And he runs because he doesn't even have an army with him there. And they decide, well, what are we going to do now? Does the rebel who led our revolt want to be king? No. Well, who do you think should be king? I think Frederick should be king. Who's Frederick? Well, up north from Prague, there's this beautiful place called the Palatinate. And Frederick's bloodline goes back to ancient Rome. I mean, it's one of the oldest royal families in Europe. He is one of the people that elects emperors. He's just a kid at that point. And he has just gotten married with Elizabeth Stuart, the daughter of King James of England. This is seen as very exciting again by the Rosicrucians because in Frederick's capital of Heidelberg, there is a ton of alchemy and hermetic stuff going on. And there's a beautiful garden that's built based on the ancient engineering of Vitruvius and based on Decaus and Inigo Jones, sort of using mathematics and engineering to make statues that could make sounds when the wind blew a certain way, or that statues that would move. It was almost like a Disneyland.
Wow.
But to the Catholics, it was considered a gate to hell because all of this was black magic,
Yeah.
not science. And that this magical place of Heidelberg, where one of the greatest libraries of esotericism, but just one of the greatest libraries in general, was another place like Prague that attracted all of these people. And many of them who'd been in Prague and were now fleeing from the Catholics were now coming to Heidelberg, where
Mhm.
they were safer. And they began to see this as the marriage of Germany, or as they called it, of the Rhine and the Thames, of Germany and England. And to them, it meant that this holy war against the Pope was one step closer because now they had a young German prince to whom all the Protestant princes of Germany owed loyalty, and they had the daughter of the King of England. So certainly that he's going to support her whatever she does,
Mhm.
and she and her brother, who had recently died, were known to be into the Hermetic stuff, to be anti-Catholic, to be against the Holy Roman Empire, and Frederick was known to be very pious, but very interested in science and very interested in these alternative forms of belief.
Mhm.
So, about in the mid-century, there was an author named Francis Yates, a really wonderful scholar, who wrote a book called The Rosicrucian Enlightenment, based on what she had available to her at the time,
Mhm.
in which she made a lot of assumptions. And she thought that Frederick and Elizabeth were kind of like, they really were the Hermetic royals. Like they were deep into this. They were probably meeting with the Rosicrucians and they were, helping the Rosicrucians. That is not what happened. They were not connected. They tolerated all that. They were interested in it, but that wasn't what they were into either. But what disaster occurred when Bohemia offered him the throne. And he knew what that meant, that taking that throne could bring him a step closer to being declared emperor himself. There'd never been a Protestant emperor, but that's what the Protestants wanted. They thought it was only fair because the religious part of the empire was controlled by the Catholic Church. So why shouldn't the political part of the empire be controlled by the Protestants?
Mhm.
As it was now, all Catholic wasn't fair to the Protestants. And they were constantly fighting wars because the Catholics wanted to end the Protestant heresy in all its forms, Calvinism, Lutheranism, everything.
Yeah.
So Frederick gets this invitation, come be king of Bohemia, bring us back our religious freedom. And he decides that this is a calling from God. Even though King James tells him, don't do this, his own mother tells him, don't do it. The Germans won't support you. This is crazy. They're way too powerful.
Mhm.
But he feels like he's got to do it. He can't leave these people to be, punished by the Catholic Church while he lives in splendor, not that far away. So he moves all the kids and he moves the wife and everybody down into Prague and he reestablishes something very similar to what Rudolph did, where he protects freedom of religion and he's very tolerant. But that's the beginning of the end because the empire is like, no, 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 no. You're not the king of Bohemia. And they march an army toward him in Prague, and they march a Spanish army toward Heidelberg because the Catholic nobles, even the German ones around Heidelberg, are like, oh boy, I want this for me. And that kid just blew it. And I'm gonna get this. In fact, his own cousin, Maximilian of Bavaria, who he had approached and said, look, why don't we do something together? Because this isn't fair anymore. I mean, it's a Habsburg emperor every single time. And
Mhm.
in the laws of the empire, it says it is not an inherited position. We can do something about it right now. And his cousin's like, nah, leave me out of it. And his cousin's really thinking, you do it, and then I'm going to take all your shit because you got nice stuff. And that's what happened. So
Wow.
he was only king for a winter. He became known as the Winter King of Bohemia. And he lost a terrible battle because his general was a Catholic. good choice there. And he had, of course, there were Catholic spies everywhere, all through Prague, and they knew everything he did. And so he was easily defeated on the battlefield, had to flee for his life with his wife and kids, and spent the rest of his life kind of in exile, trying to get back his lands and failing and having this really miserable. The only good thing about his life, in a sense, was one, he was lucky he was a king because wherever he went, he still had food and he could throw a party.
Mhm.
But really, he had a great love affair. He and his wife were deeply in love, really an amazing relationship.
Mhm.
She gets completely just ruined by historians who try to blame everything on her. They would tell stories like, well, Frederick's mother warned him. She said the Germans won't support you, the English won't do it. You're going to be in trouble. You'll be all by yourself. But then that bitch from England who wears her gowns with her too much cleavage showing, and we don't think that's right. She came in and she gave a speech about it's the calling from God and you've got to do it. And that's what happened. That's not what happened at all. We've only found out recently. And it's amazing to go look at the books because the stories about her that make her into this kind of, revolutionary are just false. There was
Mhm.
propaganda. But book after book after book tells the same stories until just a few years ago, really. This really incredible scholar, Professor Ackerman, finally published a definitive biography of Elizabeth. She was the first one to go into Elizabeth's letters and journals and look at the real, paperwork that was left over by this empire that she was briefly, flirting with being the empress of.
Yeah.
And so that's probably that's the short version of what's happened there. And
Mhm.
I compare it to something like it's kind of a loose metaphor, but if you think about a book like Howl or On the Road, when the Beats kind of emerge in this highly industrialized, very conformist American society of the mid-century, mid 20th century, and then there are these pockets of people who are pursuing Buddhism and peyote, and
Mhm.
they consider themselves to be freaks all by themselves in the midst of this sea of conformity. And when Howl gets published, when On the Road gets published, those people go, "Whoa, that's for me. Like I'm part of that. That this is the way I see the world." And other people read the stuff and they get really excited. They're like, "I want to be like this. I want to see the world this way. This makes more sense than what I'm told is going on."
Mhm.
I think that the Rosicrucian manifestos were very similar to that. I think they were kind of this youthful expression of angst and hope and intelligence and rejecting the stagnant status quo. And I
Mhm.
think there were a bunch of people scattered throughout Europe who had already begun experimenting with these ideas and reading the same books, and they were terribly excited by it when they saw that, wow, somebody put this in a book and there's a brotherhood that supports this.
Mhm.
There were also all of these prophecies going around, prophets and astrologers, because at the time there were comets and there were supernovas in the sky. So there were new stars, and a new star appeared just over the great conjunction of Jupiter and Saturn. And astrologers were just like, whoa, this is, here's the funny thing about it, right? The Catholic astrologers were saying it's the end of Protestantism. Like there will be the final triumph of the church and authority of God will be restored all over Europe. The Protestants are saying it means that the last pope will fail and there will be the end of the Catholic Church and the Protestants will prevail. So everybody had these ideas of what was going to happen. Everybody was wrong. And what happened instead was 30 years of war, which we call the 30 Years' War between
Mhm.
Protestants and Catholics. And what goes with that? Terrible plagues, the death of something like, 20% of the people in Europe, And in the end, there was still a Catholic Church and there were still Protestants. But they realized, I guess we're not going to get rid of each other.
Yeah.
Meanwhile, in England, many of the people who are interested in Rosicrucianism are looking over at America and are saying, look, we can't, it's not going to work in Europe. Europe is tainted by all of this. But if we go to America and we start new colonies, and then we can revive this vision. And so, Cromwell, for example, I mean, that's one of the weird things about Rosicrucianism. I mean, it starts out as this radical kind of freedom oriented universal reformation, individuality, uniqueness, and it turns into Cromwell and his industrialized new model army. And he and some of the main thinkers around him, like Marvell and even Milton, are reading Rosicrucian stuff. They are inspired by it. Cromwell wants to establish a Rosicrucian utopia once he's killed off all the undesirables, including all the Protestants.
Yeah.
And so, I'm sorry, the Catholics. And so it's so weird because it kind of became the opposite of what it had been. It had been this call for freedom and science, and it had been a celebration of theater. And then Cromwell gets inspired by it, and he closes and demolishes all the theaters in England and creates a military dictatorship that is supposed to somehow get us to this Rosicrucian paradise that he's inspired by. Andreae lives long enough to see Cromwell taking these steps in England. And I'm sure he must have been astonished to see ideas that he had come up with, like having this effect that he never would have understood. But this is typical of countercultures. Usually, they're just reactions to stagnant, dominant cultures. But there are times when they become popular enough that they become the dominant culture and they can be quite fanatic. You could even argue, I would say, that maybe what we're seeing today in America is a counterculture that took over and has a pretty radical vision of what they think the future should look like. And
Mhm.
they're moving with that kind of um, let's call it enthusiasm that countercultures usually have when they become dominant cultures, because they
Yeah.
know they're right.
Yeah.
And so, in this case, we slowly see Rosicrucianism do this, and it does it
Yeah.
later in other places. Like it inspires this Freemasonic, a lot of Freemasonic stuff. But one of them is the Order of the Golden and Rosy Cross, which is sort of a group of elites. It slowly spreads throughout Europe, and in Prussia, two members of that society become the main counselors that kind of run everything for the king of Prussia. And they're terrible. They're like censoring everything and controlling everything. And they're the opposite of this universal reformation idea, but they consider themselves Rosicrucians. And
Mhm.
again, they think that somehow they're imposing this Rosicrucian enlightenment on people. When if you read the spirit of the original manifestos, it's not like that. It's a much
Yeah.
more individualized kind of vision. So that's kind of the short version. It's not very short, but that's I think who was behind it, Andreae,
Yeah.
the context of it, and these really important royals. Rudolph, who was a terrible disappointment, and Frederick, who turned out to be an even bigger disappointment, even though he kind of did want the job that they were trying to get him to want.
So who kind of who kind of helps carry that torch past, I guess, the disappointments? Is there like a specific person or a group, I guess, in
Oh, there's a whole
England that
bunch of them,
like
because
I'm sure
it
Bacon
has all
possibly.
kinds of effect. Like in some
Yeah.
ways, um, we're pretty sure, for instance, that Francis Bacon's New Atlantis was inspired by some of this. So they're inspiring people who would never consider themselves, I don't think, Rosicrucians. I mean, Francis Bacon, the Rosicrucians loved Paracelsus, and Francis Bacon said, yeah, Paracelsus takes this, as above, so below thing way too far. the
Yeah.
macrocosm, microcosm. He stretches it way too far. So he's not very Rosicrucian-y,
Hmm.
unless he's faking it. That's the other thing about all this stuff, right?
Yeah,
I mean, we
true.
have we have the story of Flood and Meyer, right? These two amazing thinkers who published books and explored all these different areas of understanding and knowledge, and each had strong influence and were suspected of being Rosicrucians very strongly for generations. People have said that they were friends and that they helped each other and that Meyer initiated Flood into Rosicrucianism. Well, the new research shows that there is zero evidence that they ever became friends. And the only mention that we have found where one talks about the other is Meyer in a letter to Moritz the Learned, who is saying some very uninitiate like things about Flood. He's saying, I read, some manuscript by him where he said that German people are drunken oafs, and how dare he? And I'm so angry. And then he says the British are good people, and they're, he said, I will whip him with words unless you tell me that you don't want me to. It just doesn't sound like, initiates talking about each other. And on top of it, we have Meyer said in one of his books, I am not a Rosicrucian. And he was just, no. And
It's
then
kind of
Flood,
sounds like the whole Fed joke, like I'm not a cop thing, I promise I'm not a cop,
right,
but I don't know.
exactly. That's the thing. That's what's so funny about it is you
Yeah.
don't know. So maybe they were friends.
Hmm.
And maybe that letter was meant to make it look like they weren't friends.
Yeah.
And maybe there's no evidence that they were friends because they were careful to hide all the evidence. And this is very seductive because you look at their work and you go, well, how could these guys not be friends?
Yeah.
They're both into the same stuff.
Hmm.
So that's the mystery within the mystery within the mystery of these things. Now, there were also people, to make it even more complicated, who carry on Rosicrucianism, to answer your question, because they just say, I'm a Rosicrucian. So the Paracelsians, for example, Paracelsists, they read these, they get very excited by the manifestos. They want to be Rosicrucians. They don't get a response when they say that they want to be members. They get angry because they didn't get a response. And they say, well, wait a minute. We're everything that this book says. So we are the Rosicrucians. And then they start coming out and publishing books saying, we are the Rosicrucians. No, you're not.
Yeah.
I mean, in a way you are, I guess, because you're practicing Rosicrucian ideas, but there's a big difference between practicing Rosicrucian ideals and saying I am a Rosicrucian. And so but yet they continue this legacy in a big way, right? Some of it
Hmm.
goes to America in the form of German pietism with books like The Secret Symbols of the Rosicrucians, which are kind of a combination of Jacob Boehme and Rosicrucian ideas and Paracelsian stuff in the Bible. Um, people start to say, well, Paracelsus was a Rosicrucian. Almost anybody that was into mathematics and early science and also into the Western esoteric tradition, boom, you're a Rosicrucian. So it keeps rolling forward as people argue these things out. No, they're not. You can't say, people say Abraham Lincoln was a Rosicrucian. Um, Napoleon was a Rosicrucian. Disney was a Rosicrucian. Well, what do you mean by that? Do you mean that they took lessons that they found an ad for in the back of a comic book from one of the public Rosicrucian orders in America, which is a completely different thing that isn't really connected except in terms of some ideas?
Yeah.
Um, so it continues by people reinventing it over and over again. It gets very mixed up with theosophy. And I think that calling it theosophical Rosicrucianism is probably accurate because it has almost more theosophy to it. And when you're looking at Max Heindel or you're looking at Spencer Lewis, or for that matter, Manly Hall, especially his early writings about Rosicrucianism,
Mhm.
it's very theosophy society. The Rosicrucians are invisible masters and they have secret powers. And, she met one in Cairo, Madame Blavatsky, and all that stuff.
Hmm.
very different from that first wave of Rosicrucianism. And so it has become something that is almost unrecognizable to what it started as. It would be almost like imagine if people created beatnik societies where everybody got together and had, a breakfast and they did some service for the city. And then they had a little study session about some, beatnik poem or something. I mean,
Yeah.
it's not the beats, right? You're not doing
Yeah.
anything they were doing, you're just studying what they did, kind of, but
Yeah.
it reinterpreted.
Hmm.
So that's how it continued. It even got enshrined into Masonry, where in the Scottish Rite, for instance, one of the degrees is a Knight of the Rose Cross.
Hmm.
And some people have argued that, well, when Rosicrucianism died in Germany, in Europe, it was born as Freemasonry in England and in Scotland. Doesn't seem likely, but not a lot of evidence that that's the case, and certainly very different, again, goals going forward.
Yeah.
But certainly Rosicrucian ideas were very influential to the people who were putting Freemasonry together. But they wanted something that was, it's funny because it's almost it's so different because in Germany you're dealing with, I think, these students at colleges who are radical. They're all hopped up on radical writing that's forbidden. You're not supposed to read it. And and then over here, the Freemasons, these are generally elite people, or at least people who are very well off, and they are reading books and they're getting together to do ceremonies that kind of teach basic principle. And it's just a very different animal
Yeah.
from this individualized Rosicrucian approach of the manifestos. So I think that while the Universal Reformation was a serious idea about changing the whole world, the idea of it was that you were to apply it in your own world. Like we're supposed to read the book and then wake up, and in our world, we apply these ideas about education and kindness and healing, and and it turns into over and over again hierarchies and organizations, and that doesn't seem to be there in the beginning.
A part of that process of it coming to America, or
Mhm.
part of it coming to America, was it brought over by any specific people, a part of the British Empire or like the Virginia Company?
Yeah. There were four people involved in the original Virginia colonies, in the kind of a treasurer, a secretary to the treasurer, a board member, who were all influenced by Michael Myers' ideas about America being a place where this Rosicrucian utopia could take form away from the Catholic Church, away from the Holy Roman Empire. And that's why they seeded America with Puritans ultimately, because this was an effort to make sure that the Spanish Catholics didn't get America,
Mhm.
that it would have a chance to come to life as this Rosicrucian utopia. At the same time, you had these German pietists a little bit later moving to Pennsylvania, creating Woman of the Wilderness and then Ephrata cloister, and they're bringing with them, as I mentioned, the ideas of Jacob Boehme and Rosicrucian ideas and Paracelsian ideas. But they're not very interested in politics. They get as far away from authorities as they can. They believe the end of the world is imminent. They have a telescope on top of the tallest building in their settlement, and they watch for signs of the end of the world in the heavens. But at the same time, they're creating this incredible unearthly music, and they're creating this amalgam of European metaphysical religion that ultimately becomes American metaphysical religion. And then you've got people like John Winthrop the Younger, who um, this is the son of John Winthrop the Elder, the governor of Boston, uh, of the Massachusetts Bay Colony and of the city of Boston.
Mhm.
And he's considered, he's the guy who said the thing about a city that's like a shining light on a hill. And he is the pilgrim's pilgrim. But his son John Winthrop the Younger was deeply into the Rosicrucians and into alchemy and astrology and into John Dee. In
Hmm.
fact, he brought with him when he came to America a number of John Dee's manuscripts, some of his alchemical equipment, and he marked the barrels in which he brought those things to America with John Dee's famous symbol, the Monas Hieroglyphica, which is really amazing. I mean, this
Yeah.
is, like a pentagram or something. It's an occult symbol.
Yeah.
So the son of the governor of Massachusetts Bay Colony shows up with cannons firing, with, yay, he's here, with barrels marked with the occult symbol of John Dee. And his father says, sure, set up an alchemical lab in our house. So he's practicing alchemy and astrology in the house of the governor, which is not to say that there weren't other pilgrims who were like, hey, what's your kid doing? But he was able to do it for some time before he felt pressured, and then he left and was one of the founders of the Connecticut territory. He became a very famous alchemist. He was the healer for the whole territory. He created these alchemical medicines that were supposedly so effective that people who could survive the journey even came from Europe to be treated by him. He tried to create a
Mm.
college of light. He was one of the celestial intelligencers, so he was in touch with all the leading intellectuals of the day, and he was inviting them all to come to Connecticut and start the College of Light and, do exactly what Comenius had planned. And he did these, he healed for free. His medicines, he didn't charge people for them. There was a place in Connecticut that was called Governor's Hill until fairly recently, where he was said to go to make gold whenever he ran out of money. And he did all kinds of scientific experiments. He became good at desalinization. He invented a better way to extract iron ore. He was very good at keeping his people out of the King of England's wars. He would always say things like, well, first he would just ignore the order to send troops as long as he could. And then he would say, well, I need these guys to finish building my iron factory. And you want that, right? Because you need iron. Very good at protecting tribes who had been decimated by disease and were being enslaved by other tribes. And he put himself in the middle of it and protected these smaller tribes. He was kind of a Rosicrucian, and he claims that he never met one, that he just loved the ideas. And he did travel to Europe and other places looking for Rosicrucians and was always disappointed by the people he met. But he decides, I'm going to live these principles myself. So, I mean, he may be the best person to point to and say, there, that's a Rosicrucian, but he certainly isn't part of a direct lineage going back to Germany or even beyond that earlier to Father CRC, who was probably a mythical character or a caricature of somebody like John Dee.
So you mentioned John Dee did meet with Rudolph.
Hmm.
Do you think he could have been involved with, I mean, obviously probably involved with the Rosicrucians and that I guess like with what you just explained, kind of bringing over some of the ideas and the alchemy from the British Empire.
I think he was an inspiration to them
Yeah.
because I think as he went around Europe and he was visiting with people like Moritz, he was telling them, we've got to take on the Pope. We've got to take on the power of the empire. There are all these great, I'm talking to the angels, using this Enochian language, and they're telling me that it's time.
Yeah.
And I think that he was a big inspiration to them.
Yeah, he's a fascinating person to kind of look into, especially during that time period.
Hmm.
With Prague, did that kind of fall apart, that I guess capital of alchemy?
Well, it was terrible because after the defeat of Frederick, the Catholics took over and they just killed it out. And
Gotcha.
And then after that, I mean, the whole history was just, it was part of the empire for the longest time. Um, Eventually, it would be taken over by the Nazis, and then it would be taken over by the Soviets. So it really suffered generations of oppression. And it's funny because in Prague, amongst those who know its history, they say that this is because Rudolf cursed Prague. He was so angry that they just kind of meekly went along with him being thrown out and his brother replacing him, even though they knew what was going to happen. He just, after all he had done for them, he supposedly got out there up on the parapet and just cursed them and
Yeah.
said, you'll suffer for what you've done to me. And so some of them believe that curse lasted until fairly recently, when they finally were able to shake it off and become an independent republic. But yeah, they suffered terribly. Heidelberg also, Frederick's home country, was just destroyed over and over again because the Spanish took it, and the French took it from the Spanish, and the Swedes were involved, and they took it one time, and so just siege after siege, battle after battle, artillery raining down on the cities. A terrible plague sweeping through it more than once. All of this caused so much suffering, especially in Prague and in Heidelberg, but throughout Europe.
So do you think like there was like a group, like I guess you would say like an elite group meeting behind the scenes to control or manipulate kind of power throughout Europe?
It happened in places like Prussia,
Hmm.
where you have historical record of two members, like I said, of the Golden and Rosy Cross, who were were pretty much a kind of a autocratic elite, and yet just because they called themselves the Golden and Rosy Cross, I mean, they were really much more like a Freemasonic order.
Gotcha.
And they were the Golden Rosy Cross was so elite, like it often included royals and the wealthiest people, which in a way I think was against the spirit of the original, which was driven by knowledge and independence and freedom of conscience. And I think that it morphed, into something else. And I think it was something that was useful in so many ways. So, for example, in America in the 19th century, we've got Randolph, who is one of the founders of these public Rosicrucian orders and is writing about the Rosicrucians. And then later in life, he admits that he never met a Rosicrucian. The only reason he said that he was trained by Rosicrucians was because, as a man of color, when he told people his theories, they didn't listen to him. But the
Yeah.
minute he said that he learned it from the Rosicrucians, everybody paid attention. And since he was trying to make a living doing this stuff, which is a pressure on a lot of these people, they try to do something desperate. They claim authority that they weren't given because they're so frustrated that they can't achieve some kind of respect from people.
Hmm.
And then Rosicrucian is one of those magic words where if you start to hint around, well, when I was in Europe, I met some people who were connected to this, and their symbol was a rose and a cross, and then all of a sudden everybody's listening. It's like, oh,
Yeah.
then you must be, an initiate. And sure enough, he was listened to enough that one of the groups that he established is still around. But he was inspiration for establishing. And so I think this happened a lot where people adopted this Rosicrucian persona.
Hmm.
They declared themselves to be Rosicrucian adepts, or for that matter, they declared other people to be. So in the theosophical form of Rosicrucianism, you will see these huge lists of people who are Rosicrucians, and they include people like, as I mentioned, Lincoln and Napoleon, and it's usually based on very tenuous evidence. I mean, if somebody read, the manifesto, that made them a Rosicrucian. Or if they knew somebody like who was interested in the Rosicrucians, then they're a Rosicrucian.
Yeah.
And those kind of definitions are so blurry,
Hmm.
that I think they're more confusing than anything, and they lead to a glamorization of the subject. And so now we think that, I mean, the average person, from my experience, especially when I was working with Manly Hall, who was interested in Rosicrucianism, including myself in the beginning,
Hmm.
really was stuck on the idea that these are initiates with superhuman powers, and they were like the Avengers or something. And who wouldn't want to be part of it? Who wouldn't want to achieve such a level of enlightenment that you could be invisible and you could live and be immortal and you could help the world? And it became this fantasy, I think, of um, mercy from, divine mercy brought by these superhumans. And I think that's ironic because if you look at the beginning of it, it's so much more just human beings, reacting to stagnant, oppressive government and having the courage to express the need for freedom and the desire for independence and to value knowledge that has been declared off limits by authorities that nobody voted to put where they are.
Yeah.
And so I think that it turns into an alienation in a way, because when we do that, we remove the humanity of the Rosicrucians, and we also kind of remove our own potential to achieve something like what they did, because we're missing what that is. We're thinking. I used to run into people like this. We're thinking, well, Rosicrucians, they can make gold whenever they want. They never get sick because they know the secret to healing, and they can help, people, and they hide. They always wear the costumes of their societies, and it's very romantic. And people who are feeling powerless or feeling left out from more acceptable forms of religion, they're really drawn to this idea, and in a way, it's a reflection of Jesus, right?
Mhm.
Because Jesus was sort of the ultimate in counterculture. I mean, a guy who's healing for free. He's telling people that, you've got this direct relationship with the divine, and he's devaluing the world of human accomplishments, the world of Caesar, and he's making the spiritual world into the most important thing of all. Like when we talked about Orpheus, turning it
Mhm.
around so that it isn't anymore a warrior is the greatest thing anyone can be. And, gods prevent me from being a woman. That's like a punishment. It turns into, no, you warriors are idiots. You're going to be born over and over and over again because you don't understand the violence that you're committing, that you're actually offending the gods. But I know the truth, and this is my last life. I know what to say when I die, so I can go on and I can live with the gods. That's a similar kind of thing. The Rosicrucians have the secrets to wealth, the secrets to health, the secrets to freedom. So people would seek that. And if they couldn't find it, they would reinvent it
Yeah.
and try to, kind of become it.
So was there kind of like a ceremonial side to, I guess, like the Rosicrucians, like the ones that kind of met up, or was there ever rumored to be that type of thing, like there is, I guess, in Freemasonry?
There wasn't in the beginning, from what I know.
Mhm.
It seemed much more like people getting together to discuss
Yeah.
and to create. It does turn into something more ritualistic with the Golden and Rosy Cross, where they are doing rituals,
Yeah.
very lavish in some places, rituals, and it becomes much more Masonic at that point. But for that, you need hierarchy. And if you look at even how they describe themselves in the manifestos, the Rosicrucians are non-hierarchical. They're just brothers, and they pick somebody to replace them when they're going to die, but they don't have a leader. There isn't one person who's the head of the order.
Yeah.
They are all the order together. So it's quite different, really, from this hierarchical, ritualized unveiling of steps, right? That's what Freemasonry is doing. It's
Yeah.
taking you using ritual up a series of realizations about important principles required for living a good life, for getting in touch with your soul, if you will. And that's not really, from what I can tell, the Rosicrucians were more like, have you read the latest book from Paracelsus?
Yeah.
Let's all get together and read passages from it. Oh, I'm going to bring Boethius. I found something in there that's awesome.
Mhm.
It really does feel more like people who are enthusiastic about these studies getting together.
Kind of like a hippie movement of the time,
Kind
I
of,
guess.
yeah. Yeah. Like
People
because
like,
in terms of the intellectuals at college,
yeah,
being the leaders of these ideas. But even there, with the hippies, you tended to have more of a hierarchical thing going on.
sure.
But with these guys, it wasn't like that. It was
Yeah.
much more, I think, based on an equal brotherhood. And there were women, by the way. I should mention there were the Sisters of the Rosy Cross. There was even a book that was purported to be written by the Sisters of the Rosy Cross. But who are they? Again, it's funny because I'm reminded, and of course, we always project ourselves into history. That's one of the
Hmm.
pitfalls of writing about it. And it's something I'm constantly struggling with, especially when I was doing this book. But it reminded me a lot of my experiences in Riot Girl
Okay.
because it's like, one band comes along, Bikini Kill, and they kind of crystallize this idea, and then their ideas spread, and then somebody in some distant place runs into these ideas, and they made their own band and their own zine, and then they had to declare their existence, right? So that others would know that they're here. And that's what it reminds me of with these Rosicrucian books. So the Sisters of the Rosy Cross, it reminds me of it's like, well, we read, the manifesto, and then a bunch of us women got together and we created our own Rosicrucian group. And here's the book that declares our existence. And it's filled with the same kind of metaphorical writing. So they say, we're able to fly, we're able to be invisible, but then they explain that those are metaphors. That what they really mean is that they have spiritual elevation,
Yeah.
that they know how to heal because they understand, the magic of herbs and what's good for what. And some of them do these kinds of books and they don't explain that it's metaphor. And then people come along and they think, oh, well, then this must be literal. So, for instance, Rosicrucian invisibility, which many people thought simply meant that the rule, which they talked about, that they take on the customs of the places where they live so they don't stand out,
Hmm.
that's what invisibility is. You don't tell people about your group and you look like everybody else and you show interest in the things that everybody else is interested in. And that way, nobody knows that you're a Rosicrucian. But other people came along and said they're invisible. They can make themselves invisible. Literally, there could be a Rosicrucian standing here right now, and we wouldn't even know it.
Yeah. Do you think any of that ceremonial stuff, even with like Freemasonry, might be like a type of magic that they're attempting or maybe actually doing?
I think
Or do you
it's
even think that exists? I don't know. I'm sorry, that might be a odd question, but
no, I think it's a good question, but I think that it's not, well, how do I put this? There are various forms of magic. If you're talking about magic as, you know, I'm going to do a ritual so I can get an opportunity for a better job or find a girlfriend. If you're talking about magic as I'm going to avenge myself on an enemy, or you're talking about magic as accruing power to self, those forms of magic, it is not. But there's another form of magic which is related to the Neoplatonic and earlier art of theurgy, which is literally making oneself a god or union with a god. And this is a process by which we sort of make ourselves into a living statue for a god. We conform ourselves so much to that God. We gather the correspondences associated with that God. We know the right time of day and the day of the week and the day of the month and all that in order to reach this God, to have the best possible conditions. Not because they can't reach us, but because we have such a hard time being open to that kind of communication. And
mhm.
if we do all this the right way, we live the right kind of life and we do the right kind of ritual, then we are lifted and we have that epiphany of cosmic consciousness and of divine vision that allows us to see what might be happening in the world next or far away, or divine vision that lets us see what we need to be doing or where we are messed up and need to correct ourselves. And I think that that's what Freemasonry is after in this very organized kind of step by step approach of these rituals for each degree. They're trying to lift people. It's like, Albert Pike's Morals and Dogma for the Scottish Rite, which is heavily based on Eliphas Levi, by the way, the ceremonial magician,
Mhm.
but also on Neoplatonism and the Hermetica. That he writes about each degree in there, and each lesson is a lesson about how to live life, how to be a better human being, and what happened in history, at least from this point of view. And it's odd because with Pike, you're dealing with a guy who was a Confederate. He actually commanded a battalion, I think it was, of indigenous Americans who were fighting against the Union.
Mhm.
And he was somebody that had a slave. And he wrote about it, and he basically said, well, slavery is a necessary evil. What are we going to do? It's here. And he said, my slave is somebody who takes menial jobs away from me, so I have more time to write morals and dogma. And he said that, most slave owners are good to their slaves anyway, that kind of bullshit. And um, that got his statue torn down during protests not too long ago.
I could see why.
And yet he he does make some nice points about living a good life, and he does try to make it very clear, even in Morals and Dogma, look, if you're going to be a slave owner, you need to treat them the way that a master treats an apprentice.
Mhm.
You're not there to use and abuse them. You're there to help lift them and to teach them, which is like it's slavery, man. I
Yeah,
mean, but he was trying to address it in some way. It's
yeah,
very problematic. But I think that he typifies this idea of step by step, we deepen, the understanding of life of our initiates. And so each degree that they accomplish and the ritual that reflects that degree is meant to open up for them a greater level of understanding and a closer connection to the soul and to divine communion. But that had, as far as I know, nothing to do with Andre and those early manifestos, except in some form of inspiration, perhaps. But
yeah.
they were actually kind of fleeing the hierarchy and the organization, and they were specifying individuality, you know.
Like that individuality and like this spirituality. I know it's kind of a tongue
And
twister.
politically follow your own religion, and also creatively to be an individual, to do something that's different, and that's okay. It's not okay for the church to say that my book isn't allowed to exist.
Hmm.
It's okay for me to write a book that the church says shouldn't exist. All knowledge should be the human province.
Yeah, that's an interesting point about the book because it seems like in that time period, and I don't know if this is tied to Rosicrucianism or anything like that, but you do see kind of a lot of people writing under different names or finding somebody else to write under. I know Shakespeare is like one of the largest ones to let people talk about. Was that kind of tied to the Rosicrucians? Was anybody a part of them kind of tied to that? And did they kind of use that method
Yeah,
to kind of
it
push
would
through?
pop up. They
Yeah.
were used, but again, this partly because they had to,
Hmm.
because they were facing, really serious consequences for holding these beliefs. If you were living in a town that the Catholic Church got control over and you'd written a book about this stuff, you could be in serious trouble. So they often wrote under these pseudonyms. They would sometimes give hints about who they were. So, for example, there are puzzles in the manifestos that seem to point to Andre, like certain numbers that add up and they add up to his name and or there's a coat of arms that happens to be Andre's family coat of arms, that's in the narrative. So there are these little hidden messages, definitely like code and secret symbology and all of that, which is used for, I think, at least two reasons. One is to stay safe, and to hide the message from people who might try to abuse it. And secondly, because it's kind of the only way to teach this stuff. When you're trying to teach this soul building, this awakening of the soul stuff, it's hard to do with very concrete language because the intellect will defeat you. And the intellect is constantly trying to pin these things down and missing the point. So they're trying to frustrate you in a way so that, like a Zen koan, your brain will give up for a minute and you might have the intuition, your soul can speak. I do think that's part of it. And I think it's also just kind of a creative outburst where again, they're taking the whole world as their province. They were told Plato is pagan. You shouldn't be looking at that. You shouldn't be looking at the ancient Egyptians. And they were like, no, no, no. This stuff's great. In fact, you can be a better Christian if you study this stuff.
Mhm.
In a similar way, Pico della Mirandola created a Christian Kabbalah. And there were many other authors who did this, Reuchlin and others. They felt there was no reason that you couldn't practice Kabbalah to understand Christianity better.
Super interesting. Do you think any of those kind of people, or have you kind of like maybe found any evidence of people like that kind of like escaping or like leaving, I guess like Europe, the British Empire, coming over here to America under, I guess, a different name in disguise?
There's rumors. Again, in Theosophical Rosicrucianism, you've got stories of actual Rosicrucians coming to Carmel, California before the manifestos were ever printed or even written, probably. Probably not true. It's based on having found crosses with roses carved on them, carved out of coral in the Carmel area that were
Hmm.
associated with the missions. But the thing is that both Jesus and Mary were referred to as the Rose of Sharon in tradition. And so this could simply be a regular cross with a rose on it. It
Yeah,
doesn't have to be Rosicrucian. That's part of what happens is right this
yeah.
everywhere you see a rose, it's got to be Rosicrucian.
Mhm.
But this reinvention of personalities or using pseudonyms is a constant in later Rosicrucianism. And it was in the beginning because those three manifestos were published anonymously. And it's funny because, especially when people weren't really sure about Andre, they weren't really sure who was behind it, they never really thought to read Andre's other books. And they didn't, really realize that this guy had spent most of the rest of his life kind of reacting to what happened and restating it and modifying it. And he lived, he's had a very dignified career as a Lutheran theologian of very high development. He was a tutor kind of spiritual guide to a famous princess of Württemberg, who was really also in herself brilliant and artistic and a really excellent ruler. And so you can't, it's so hard to recognize him. It's almost like, I can't think of an example, but it's like he was this radical when he was a kid but then he turns into this very dignified, very well established person. And yet his beliefs don't really change very much. He's still anti Catholic. He
Yeah.
still is dreaming up Christian utopias. He still believes that there needs to be a reformation, but his later writing lacks the fire, right? In the especially in the Fama. I mean, this is revolution is coming. It's like this declaration. This won't be stopped. Later, he's got a much more kind of measured approach as he's writing on these subjects. He's older and more experienced, and he's experienced the consequences of it because even though he backed up immediately and was like, whoa, okay, this is not what I was trying to do, the world rolled over him. The wars, the 30 Years' War, which is partially triggered by his manifestos, rolls over him. He has to move out and hide in the woods because they come and they pillage his house and he sees the result of this Catholic Protestant hatred for each other.
speaking of like Catholicism, the Pope just died. Do you think that
Yeah.
there's any kind of like weird stuff behind that or kind of any symbolism or
The Vatican is such a trip. I mean, I don't know what to think of it. I mean, sometimes I'm really with Crowley when he used to call it the Black Lodge. He was like,
yeah.
no, that's black magic. I
Oh
get where he was
yeah.
coming from with that.
There's
Especially
a
when you
lot.
read these histories and you're just like,
Hmm.
oh my God. I mean, the dominance. Um, right now we're living in fear of a surveillance state
Hmm.
that is just really trying to impose on us with somebody like Thiel
Hmm.
working on Palantir and all that. And the church had it. I mean, when they ruled Europe during the Dark Ages, the confessional was universal surveillance
Yeah.
because priests were compelled. I mean, you had to tell your superior if something was told to you in confession that might be important to the church. What a deal. you
Yeah.
know, I mean, incredible. And so um, I think that what's really going on in there, I don't know. Sometimes I think of
Yeah.
South Park where there was a giant spider that was actually the hidden god of the Vatican, because what they do is so weird. I mean,
Yeah.
I always look at it and I think, I mean, they do a lot of good. Let's not forget that. There's a lot of Catholic charity that does incredible things in the world.
Hmm.
But at the same time, you look at like the splendor of the Vatican.
Yeah.
Every time I see it, I'm just, what does that have to do with Jesus?
Yeah.
You know? And also, this unholy marriage with Rome that the church took on. And then its Holy Roman Empire, its military arm that it used a lot. What does that have to do with the Prince of Peace and turning the other cheek? So I'm left really like I don't get it. I
Yeah.
don't I don't know what they're doing there. And I wonder what's in the Vatican, because my guess is that there's still incredible things there, books and things that will, might change the world, but we don't get to see them. And who's making those decisions? And how did they amass that kind of wealth? And why did they do that? Considering who they were representing, there's so many questions in it, and the politics of that church are so filled with intrigue and underhandedness and um, yeah, it's a great mystery to me. It's sort of charming to me because it's almost a continuation of the pagan mysteries in its splendor and ritual,
Yeah.
and
Yeah.
I can see
For
why it
sure.
moves people.
Yeah.
It's sort of the last bit of that we have in the world. But at the same time, it so thoroughly displaces the example of the founder.
Yeah.
And so I don't know what they're doing in there, man. I can't even answer your question because and I've heard the weirdest things, like I had a friend who was a defrocked Catholic priest who used to work at the Vatican.
Hmm.
And two of the things that he told me, just as an example, there was more, but he told me that the Vatican has the world's greatest pornography collection,
God. What?
historical pornography. And
Man.
he told me that Jim Morrison never died,
Holy
that
shit.
he disappeared with the help of the Catholic Church and became a choir master in a monastery in France, where he was living quite happily away from fame and drugs and all that stuff, just being able to make music. And even though he wasn't strictly Catholic and had never become a sincere Catholic, the church had protected him all these years and given him a place to live. I don't know. I mean,
Yeah.
this is just all hearsay, but just that shows you, I think, that's how far the tentacles go. That
Yeah.
stories like that are being circulated by Catholic priests who sang for the Pope.
Wow. Yeah.
Um, and yeah, there's something there. They are interesting, that's for sure.
Yeah. Like you said, I mean, their tentacles probably can spread pretty far. I mean, with that amount of power and kind of, I guess, pushing Jesus by force, throughout a large portion of the time. And,
Well,
Well,
their
that's
interpretation of Jesus, that's the
yeah,
other
true.
thing. I
Yeah,
mean,
exactly.
killing, so many Europeans because your idea of Jesus is wrong.
Hmm.
Our idea of Jesus is right. I love when they finally settled. They were like, okay, okay, you know what? You can be Protestants, but your shit belongs to us. They did that. They're like, any priest who
Dang,
wants to go be
like
a
the mafia.
Protestant, go for it. But your land, your books, your church, they belong to us.
Wow, they're like the mob, kind of
They are. Well, I think they are. I
the
mean, they're
shakedown.
so similar in a way. You know, the
Yeah,
Godfather films come to
dude.
mind. But yeah, there's a the other weird thing about the Catholics though is there were Catholic Rosicrucians. There are and were Catholics who were really interested in the occult, and I'm talking high up. And for instance, when the relations between Rudolph II and the Pope got really bad, and the Pope refused, I'm sorry, and Rudolph refused to take confession or even, be blessed by a priest, the Pope sent a priest to be his new confessor, who was a great scholar of Neoplatonism and of the Western esoteric tradition, who could talk to him about Kabbalah and astrology and all this stuff. And I think he was a Jesuit. So, and the Jesuits, Robert Flood, who we mentioned, for example, he got into a book and pamphlet war with a Jesuit. His name was Marcen, who was the mentor of Descartes. And Marcen attacked Flood as being wrong about music and about many other things that he theorized from a Hermetic point of view and considered him to be a heretic. And the funny thing about it is that Mersen's passion for science and for logical, rational thinking actually became one of the foundations of science and totally undermined his Catholic world, right? I mean,
Mhm.
he didn't realize, neither he nor Flood, that their argument about these things was actually opening the door to science, throwing God and the Rosicrucians out of the idea of what belongs in reality. Um, so, there's a famous joke about Jesuits, which is I once saw this collection of jokes about basically Catholic jokes, clergy jokes, for clergy to tell about each other. And they said that the news was filled with headlines that proof of the existence of Jesus had been found. And so the Franciscan says, "Oh, praise the Lord. They found proof of Jesus' life." And the Dominican says, "Ah, the wisdom of the Lord to reveal the truth now." And the Jesuit says, "There really was a Jesus?"
Were the Jesuits like a military arm for the Catholic Church or the Vatican?
Ideological, yeah. In
Okay.
ideological sense, very much so, because they kind of pop up. The Society of Jesus pops up when the Counter Reformation pretty much fails. And the Pope realizes this isn't going to be quick and easy. Like the Protestants are digging in. And so this new brotherhood is formed to think and plan for the future, to come up with strategies, ways to be able uh, to get what they want, but in more subtle ways now, because they can't just fight and get it. They have to be political about it. And so there, for example, the Dominicans took a lesson from, I think, the Jesuits in dealing with Rudolph, because he got sick of them bullying the population, trying to force conversions, and he threw them out. But before they left, they decided to hire a master painter to paint a masterpiece for Rudolph, knowing about his thing about art.
Mhm.
And so once they told him that, he said, "Okay, okay, you can stay." But you can't bully everybody and try and make them all Catholics. So there was that kind of manipulation kind of enters. It originally, the Pope is so powerful, that It's like if I excommunicate you, you're finished. I mean, just
Yeah.
finished. But Protestantism ended that. That power wasn't so scary anymore. You could go off to somewhere where there were Protestants and you'd probably be welcomed for being excommunicated by the Antichrist, which is what even the Rosicrucian manifestos call the Pope.
Yeah.
And, they saw the Catholic Church as pagan. They said, look at the wealth. Look at the underhandedness of the politics. Look at, these are pagans. This isn't Christian. They have idols everywhere. All their paintings and their statues and all that's not Christianity.
Mhm.
And so the Pope was seen as the Antichrist by these Protestant rebels.
I can kind of see why. I mean, again, like you mentioned, it kind of goes against, I guess, the teachings of Jesus and like not having any like idols. He kind of seems to be like Jesus 2.0. Pope seems to be that. Lift him up and praise him like he is some sort of God. While they are doing these like extremely odd rituals that I would love to hear an explanation for at some point. I'm sure there's a reason for it somewhere, but uh,
Yeah, I don't know what they're I actually, for one thing, they're so impenetrable. Um, there's not a lot of understanding, in my opinion, of what has really gone on because of the way that so much is dependent on what pope was in charge and what that pope was trying to accomplish. And now, on one level, you can look at all that beautiful art and architecture and say, well, that exists because of the church. If the church, didn't take the money and pay Da Vinci and Michelangelo and, create these beautiful cathedrals, then none of that would exist. So what are they supposed to do? Pay for it and then not own it? It's a very sticky, weird thing to be an organization that is over 2,000 years old,
yeah, yeah,
roughly.
yeah. It's extremely interesting. Well, man, Ronnie, I really appreciate your time. Do you have anything coming up, and you want to let it everybody know where to find you?
You can always find me. Well, I'm not going to have more stuff soon, but right now I'm on Instagram, Blue Sky, Threads.
Hmm.
I do have a YouTube channel. There's all kinds of content on that, including playlists of interviews, including the other one with you.
Hmm.
And this one will be on there. And I will be getting more stuff going on, like a Substack and a TikTok and things like that. I'm
Very cool.
getting some really valuable help to be able to make that happen. So people can keep their eyes open for activity there if that's where they prefer to be. I have two books coming out this year. The Rosicrucian one will be out in December. And then I have another one which should be out in fall called The Unobstructed Way, which is about this amazing, just the most amazing story about American metaphysical religion I ran into when I was writing my book on the subject. And
Wow.
I wanted to work with Tamara to create like a really in-depth look at the belief system and the history behind the unobstructed universe teachings. And I will be doing classes for the Theosophical Society in August, um, which will be about four different couples in the esoteric world, because I find that really interesting.
Yeah.
It's really tough just to be in a relationship, to be in love with somebody, and
Mhm.
then to work with somebody who you love is really difficult. And then to be on spiritual paths together while you're doing all this other stuff. If you look at the history of it, it hasn't worked out too great, even for some wonderful teachers. And so I wanted to take a deeper look at some of these relationships, like MacGregor Mathers and his wife Moina from the Golden Dawn,
Mhm.
but then also at Robert Masters and Jane Houston. She was one of the, God, I mean, together they basically invented the human potential movement, and she did incredible work on ceremony and mythology and our own personal myths. And then he almost single-handedly revived the worship of the ancient Egyptian goddess Sekhmet. Um,
Mm.
they had a pretty neat relationship. They're one of the few
Yeah.
examples, I think, of it working out well, but many of them are so difficult. So we're going to be looking at that. We're going to look at Ted Hughes and Sylvia Plath also, and I've got Julia Gordon Bramer coming in for that, who's an expert on the occult side of Sylvia Plath and on their relationship. And then there's some other things I can't talk about yet. I don't know if they're going to happen or not, but they would be very cool if they did. But I can't really go there. So um, you can always Google me, and there's all kinds of information. There's connections to music and film, and because Tamara and I, my partner, have done a lot of work together in all kinds of areas. So we'll keep you entertained if you if you go down the rabbit hole of Ronnie Pontiac.
Yeah. Well, man, I appreciate your time so much. Y'all check them out. Send the good vibes that the cool shit does happen for you. So, man, I thank you so much. I appreciate you.
Thanks
Listen
for having me here,
close.
man. Really like
It's
talking
the
to you.
occult folk. It's the occult folks. It's the occult folks.